Well, guys, the second edition of the CONCACAF Nations League is almost up, and it seems like June is just around the corner. But before we get to these predictions for these final four, let's take a trip down memory lane back to our 2019 through 2021 edition and see what happened. From League C all the way up to League A, there were some fantastic group stage games, but in that top flight, it led us to these final four where the U.S. wound up defeating Honduras with a late goal from Jordan Pefok to get to the final. And then Mexico had to go all the way to penalties before finally getting past Costa Rica to get to the final to meet the U.S. In the meantime, in that third place match, Honduras took on Costa Rica. It was a great battle, 2-2, that led to penalties where Honduras just outstretched them with a 5-4 victory. Meanwhile, the U.S. faced two different deficits in the first 90 minutes against Mexico before Christian Pulisic scored in the 114th minute to give the U.S. the lead. And just shortly thereafter, Ethan Horvath had to come up with a huge penalty save to keep Mexico from tying the game, which gave the U.S. the first edition of this title. Now, before we get to these predictions for the semifinals in 2023, I think it's smart to go back and look at some of these recent results that these top four teams have had since the World Cup back in November and December. As you can see for the U.S., an emphatic 7-1 victory over Grenada. However, the U.S. did switch off at times when they would extend that lead in that game, as Grenada both hit the post and scored almost immediately after the U.S. made it 3-0. So a bit disappointing in that regard. But again, for the U.S., they had some really decent possession and some good opportunities in transition with space against El Salvador, but only been able to put one goal in the back of the net. A bit disappointing. However, they were able to get 6 points through those last two games. As for Mexico, it took them a while to finally get on the board against Suriname, I think until like the 64th minute in the second half. But again, still a decent result, especially in these difficult times with CONCACAF Nations League. Some of these games, especially on the road, can be very difficult. And then at home against Jamaica, Jamaica actually had the lead twice in the first half before Pineda tied it up the first time, and then Chucky Lozano did as well right before the halftime break. And then we went all square through the second 45. So a decent result for Jamaica. But as for Mexico, maybe a bit disappointing at home, even though you consider all of the pressure that comes with Mexico playing at home in the Azteca. Now for Canada, two pretty decent results with a 2-0 and 4-1 victory over Curacao and Honduras. A couple of big points to mention, though. I think that it's important. Kyle Larin, Osorio, Jonathan David have gotten on the score sheets. And then, of course, you can't forget about the threats that they have with Davies, Tejan Buchanan, and others. But also a big point to mention, not conceding as much as they did in those group stage games during the World Cup. Now, granted, they were facing tougher competition, but I think in terms of just confidence and moving forward, especially after that difficult time where I believe, not only the team, but most fans thought that they would perform better. Seeing some of these results and at least getting to this semifinal, very important for them. As for Panama, they've been on the road a lot recently. A 1-1 draw against Guatemala, which was tough. I think Guatemala scored in the 85th minute to tie that game. A 2-0 loss to Argentina, which just happened to be the night that Argentina was celebrating back home the first time with their team since the World Cup. They were able to play in Argentina. And give credit to Panama. They didn't concede in that game until the 78th minute. And then Messi, of course, made it 2-0 late. So really not a bad result at all, considering they were on the road and where they were at. Of course, nobody expecting them to win that game, especially Argentina coming home and wanting to celebrate with their fans and then looking to get a good result as well. But then picking up a 1-0 victory against Costa Rica to close out this group stage, I think very important for them. And of course, has seen them through to this semifinal now against Canada. And now finally on to prediction time for these games coming up in mid-June. I've got the U.S. and Canada both going through, and I'll give a little bit of explanation as to why. For me, I think that it's a very important game for both the U.S. and Mexico, not only for the rival's sake and the fact that these two are going to meet here shortly later in April, but the fact that these two met on this stage, but in the final just a couple of years ago, and also both of these programs in a bit of nervy times as well. I mean, of course, Mexico just recently hired their new manager, but still a lot up in the air in terms of their roster and how these guys are going to perform down the stretch, especially with these couple of windows coming up later in the year. And then, of course, for the U.S., still unsure whether Greg Berhalter is going to return, if the U.S. are going to hire another manager, as well as some key pieces potentially missing. Of course, Tyler Adams, that hamstring injury, may not play in this game, as well as depending on how the rest of the season goes with some of these U.S. players who have been injury prone. So very interested to see how these two teams are going to stack up once they do play in Vegas in June. However, I do still feel like the U.S. is going to have a bit of an advantage. And that's why I've got them going through. As for Canada and Panama, I think Panama have played incredibly well. I think they're going to come over here and put up a great fight against Canada. I think this could be a high-scoring game, especially if Canada can't seem to, find some better defensive shape and form, especially coming off November and December. And, certainly I believe that if Canada go up early, Panama are going to start throwing numbers forward and can definitely score goals if that is the case. But again, we all know how much firepower Canada has. I think they could easily put in 3 or 4 against Panama in this potentially high-scoring game, but I do have them going through to face the U.S. in this final. And as for this CONCACAF Nations League second edition final, I've got the U.S. over Canada in what could be a fantastic matchup. I could certainly see this game going into extra time or even penalties. I do feel like there will be plenty of goals scored, especially if the game opens up early on and somebody gets a goal in the first half or even first 20 to 30 minutes. But for me, I think it's going to be important for the U.S. to really try and control the midfield and look to expose Canada's back line when they can. But of course, we see how much attacking power the Canadians have and what they can do, especially in space on counterattacks or if they overload different sides of the ball as well. So I think those are 2 big focal points for these teams. And don't forget, both these teams are very good on set pieces as well, whether it be corners or free kicks, etc. So this could be a very intriguing matchup, not only for that, but the fact that, again, we've talked about Canada being kind of the self-proclaimed Kings of CONCACAF, yet they don't really have any hardware to back it up. I think the U.S. and Mexico are going to be chomping at the bit to take them down and kind of show them who's still boss. But as for the Canadians, this is something that's huge for them as well if they are able to get to this point to try and take down one of the big 2 that have been the dominant figures in CONCACAF for so long, as Canada really tries to propel themselves forward with this 2026 World Cup coming up. And any chance that these teams get to have some more bragging rights, especially with the trophy on the line, is going to be very important. So again, I do still have the U.S. advancing all the way, but if Mexico happens to get to that final, they're going to be just as excited to face off against Canada and vice versa. So again, really a very intriguing semifinal group in terms of what could potentially happen in terms of pairings for this final. But again, for me right now, I've still got the U.S. over Canada in the CONCACAF Nations League final. Guys, thanks so much for watching. As always, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Follow us along for more content and predictions coming up with more international football. And until next time, guys, peace out.